So we start off with our usual prayer for teacher and student. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Saha Viryam Karavavai Tejasvina Vaditam Astoma Vidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May we work together with great energy and vigor. May our study be illumined. Peace, peace, peace beyond all. There is a question, and as I understand it, it is in this modern age, of course, there are many technological distractions and attachments to, or things that we can attach our attention to. And so how can we deal with that? Because we are all told about detachment. We should detach. Now this question of detachment creates a lot of confusion, so it's worth answering. The idea of being attached assumes that we are attached. What does that mean? It means that we have a certain reading or interpretation of the world, and we are responding to it. This is very natural. Every biological species does it. And they do it in order to survive. And part of the survival is propagation of the species, engaging in two principal directives, in biological directives, namely that propagation of the species, and somehow surviving by taking on food, breathing, being aware of dangers. Many, many mechanisms are built into biological species to help self-preservation. And so far, modern science hasn't been able to tell us why. Charles Darwin, in the 19th century, was puzzled by this question also, but he was quite convinced that there is a relationship between all the species. But one thing that he admitted was that he hadn't spent enough time or enough attention to the effect of the environment on variations within species and the whole idea of evolution and development. So natural selection, yes. Why is it there? Don't know. But Vedanta has the answer. Your fundamental nature is existence itself, therefore you want to survive. Your fundamental nature is consciousness, therefore you know how to survive. Your fundamental nature is bliss, therefore you want to do it in the happiest possible way, devoid of pain. And so naturally, at the sophisticated level of the human being, this comes out in varying different ways. Unfortunately, it comes out also in war-like ways. And so throughout the history of man, there's been a devastation of wars. And although we are living in an age where technology is at our fingertips, based on a profound science of quantum physics, which we don't understand also. But yet we're using the effects of it. And the broadcast here is using this effect. We ignore it. What we don't know, what we take for granted, we normally ignore. But that's not a good way of living. We can't take for granted things which are profoundly important. We can't just dismiss it. And so the whole of spirituality and the whole question of attachment and detachment is a psychological one. The sophistication of the mind as an instrument cannot be underestimated, is a highly sophisticated instrument that has a correlation to the physical brain, is how we see it. Reductionists, materialists will argue, no, there's only matter and therefore nothing, you cannot have a mind separate from a brain and so on. Anyway, we don't think like that. We think that the mind is an instrument and is, in a sense, it is as physical as anything else. In the Chandogya Upanishad, the experiment is made, please fast or recite some things, now fast. Now recite them again after the fast. Oh, I can't remember. No, because in order to remember it, you require food. And so whether it's brain or mind, we have no argument. I think it's irrelevant. Swami Vivekananda also points this out, because both are material. The only difference is one is subtle and one is gross. And the subtle is the more causal. So we can say that the whole of the physical body, the whole of the physicality of the individual is a product of the mind. How we think is how the body becomes. Ego cogita sum, that famous statement by Descartes, I think therefore I am, is certainly correct. It is misinterpreted, of course, to make a division between mind and matter, and that's a kind of dualism, and that leads to many difficult problems, ultimately resulting in a kind of deism, and that leads to materialism, and so goes on. But what is this materialism? It is taking the world of matter as the only world in which we live, ignoring the mental world and ignoring the spiritual world, to put it in this way. And as long as you do this, then you're in the same position as an ant, same position as a crocodile, same position as a chimpanzee or any other species. That is, that you have to defend your territory and you have to fight and you have to defend. Now, philosophy tells us, yes, you have to fight, you have to defend, and so on and so forth, but it's an inner jihad, to use a Muslim term. It's an inner war. You have to take stock of what is happening in the mental field at any given time and immediately put yourself in a control position and steer your thought in a way that is fundamentally leading to discovery of your pure existence, your pure consciousness and bliss. And therefore, it's a joyful journey. It's not a psychological struggle. It can look like that in the beginning. So we have to have a different interpretation of the world, a different valuation of the world. And the only way that we can combat an addiction, what is an addiction? An addiction means we value or evaluate something, we think it's going to give us the highest kind of pleasure or joy. And once we do it, we are reliant and dependent on it, and we have to repeat it. And we only talk of addictions in relation to extreme addictions. Extreme addictions, alcoholism, drug addiction, and various other addictions are there that we use this word for, and there have to be special programs to deal with this, and it has a negative impact on the whole of society. But how to get out of the addiction is a struggle, because the addiction is exactly that. It's a compulsion, and that compulsion says that we have to have it. There's no other way, and we are used to having it, and the body is used to having it, and more importantly, the mind is used to having it. Take it away and you have nothing. So in principle, what we have to do is we have to replace it with another magnificent obsession, another addiction, a counter-addiction, something which is in the yogic language called sattvic. Sattvic, something that has no egoistic or egocentricity about it. something which is illuminating, something that takes us out of the problem, not takes us into the problem, something that relieves us nicely. And because by now you've picked up that the principal cause of the addiction is this evaluation of this individuality as the only existence. My body and my mind is the only thing that exists. I know in principle it exists for a short period of time. I'll ignore that factor. But right now, I'll try to struggle. And it's only a sophisticated way of doing exactly what every other biological species is doing, from a bacteria to a multicellular organism to ultimately that sophisticated instrument, that sophisticated machine that we call man. And man hasn't used this capacity. We know it's there because great saints, great sages, great people have exhibited a disinterest, a detachment. And when we say detachment, we don't mean that we detach from clothing, we detach from technology, or we detach from food, or we detach from luxuries even. It is a mental shift. It is mental detachment. Mental detachment will help you evaluate how much of it to take from the physical world and how much to leave. And where does this mental detachment come from? It comes from a new understanding, a better understanding, away from the biological self, which says that I am divine. I am the supreme. I am that infinite consciousness, infinite bliss, and infinite existence. That has to be a conviction. And this is done in various ways, directly, indirectly, and all spirituality and spiritual effort is really aimed at this self-discovery. Sometimes we can change the language. A devotee will use the language of God. A devotee will use the language of attachment to God, love of God above everything else. That's a very, very sweet way. It's a very beautiful way for most people, because it's taking the natural tendency that is uppermost in the mind in this day and age. In other ages, it might not have been so significant, but in this day and age, there's no doubt. And Paramahansa Sri Ramakrishna, he emphasizes this. On the one side of a coin is Nitya, the eternal. On the other side is Lila, the play. And the more we understand this world, the more we understand the nature of this world as a series of waves dancing and materializing as our world. Now, this should be a very obvious realization in modern science, but it's not. It should be, but it's not. If you think that this world in front of you is real, and then suddenly it disappears when you study it, then something must be going on. And so science requires philosophy. There are many, many scientists who deny this, but the reality is that science requires philosophy. And Vedanta makes a scientific presentation of the philosophy because it sees the correlation. It sees that we can get to this position of detachment by studying the world and seeing that one wave comes and one wave goes, and another wave comes and another wave goes. And it comes within a measured time framework, which we call time, conveniently put for us. And there's a space, no doubt. And so when we look at the world, we're now interpret it not as survival of the fittest. It is not about my own interests. It is now about following the model that so many have followed, that they are calm in all circumstances. It's not easy, and it's not something cultivated, it's something that it is a result. Bhagavad Gita calls it sthita prajna, steady wisdom, the state of not being disturbed by anything. But why? Is it cultivated? No. It's a natural result, it's a natural effect of a realization of the truth within everything, including oneself. So how do we lead up to this? How do we develop this? We do it by intensifying the reality that underlies everything, acknowledging the world as it is or as we have interpreted, and going a little further in our view of it, in our internal investigation. The internal in-depth investigation is called meditation. It's a process. Meditation is there not just a mere introspection, it is an internal journey. But if we don't have the time for it, then we have lost that internal journey. And the internal journey leads to an internal discovery. And you may discover it for a moment. The famous author Joel Goldsmith describes it in this way. Don't think that it is measured by time. If you reflect on it, it might seem like a fraction of a second, or it might seem like a more than that, an instant, a glimpse, an insight. Value it. It's a precious gem. The more you do it, the longer it will last, the more the connection will be. So meditation is an important function of this. Secondly, 99% of your day is not meditation sitting down. 99% of your day is dealing with the environment. And if you interpret the environment as a challenge, as a difficulty, as a problem, as something that is not suited to you, then your whole range of thinking, your whole mental field will be in the negative. It may start off with, oh, I don't look forward to going to work, or I don't look forward to getting there, or somebody doesn't like me, or maybe this person thinks of me in this way, or that person thinks of me in that way. This is why we do the Enneagram, by the way. We do the Enneagram because everyone has a specific center of orientation that becomes a difficulty for them, an obstacle in the way. And that obstacle is a carefully cultivated distinguishing factor which marks out an individuality. And so how do we get away from it? Not by squashing it. We recognize it. We honestly recognize it. This is how it is. All right, fine. But behind it is something like a sun who's exhibiting different rays. And I so happen to be a ray of that sun. And that one day I'll know I am the sun itself. One day I will say, let's say in the language of water, that I am the ocean. But I'm quite happy and prepared to say I am the wave, and the ocean sits underneath. And the purpose of the wave is to discover its own nature is water itself. Expressed in this way. Other waves are also there, expressed in their way. They're also expressing their sense of individuality. They have the same problem as I do. So why don't I try and be a cooperative wave? Why don't I flow with everything else? So that together we can all discover all waves are not separate from the depths of the ocean and the substance of the ocean, namely water. Now, if we don't realize this and cultivate this attachment to that, see, attachment to that, attachment to the internal truth, an attachment to the Lord of the universe in everything. That's how we view it. The Lord is inside everything. And every experience is the opportunity to say, there you are, there you are, there you are. I see it, I see it, I see it. Thanks. And it comes with this observation. You remember this oats I keep churning out. Observation, observe it in a correct way, not in a superficial way. Observe, appreciate, enjoy the appreciation experience. And now you're leading to thankfulness, a kind of overwhelming feeling that all is well and all will be well, a kind of internal faith that says that the divine current has brought me this far and will take me the rest of the way. That kind of attitude is there. Now, when I do that and then review everything and ask myself, what became of my attachments to the technology that I'm using, which is useful. Technology is useful. Food is useful, but I don't require it all the time. I only require it when I require it. I only eat when I'm hungry, surely. And should there be an enjoyment in eating? Absolutely, there should be. What's the use if I'm eating and it's not very tasty or something like that, or not enjoyable? Part of the joy is the joy of life itself. And I'm asked to engage in it fully. Ramakrishna's language, it's a mansion of mirth. There are some philosophers who want to do away with it. Let's do away with all materiality. Let's now sit in sackcloth and ashes. This is the medieval hermit idea. Isolate yourself, that's their version of detachment, until they actually realize the great joy. One of the fundamental books that I ask people to read is Practicing the Presence by Brother Lawrence, where he finds joy in every activity. He doesn't see it with a sense of anxiety. So everything that comes that previously we interpreted, this is not good for me, I don't like this, is transformed, and we delight. Now, we have this wonderful example. We have to mention it, of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna, we have this image of Ramakrishna, a meditating Ramakrishna, an ecstatic Ramakrishna, a dancing Ramakrishna, a Ramakrishna naked like a child Ramakrishna, a wise teaching Ramakrishna. So many different aspects. And we find that this is just a model of many, many great people. You may take him as a Paramahansa, you may take him as an avatar, take him as you will. But it's a model for all of us to say, how does a person become so lively, so full of joy, so full of a blissful expression everywhere, becoming a beacon light to light everybody? Should we not be like that? Yes, we should be. Is it difficult? I'm not saying it's easy, but we should at least take a movement to that. And that movement is to reinterpret the world. And so attachment to the essence that sits behind the expression, substance, name, and form. This is how we interpret the world. Nama Rupa, and then Sat Chit Ananda, what is behind, is Sat Chit Ananda. Existence, pure consciousness, pure bliss. If we don't go far enough, we will suffer. We will go into mental anguish. We have to go further, and there we have to touch that flowing center of joy. And we can do it because this is our own nature. It's not that we have to get it from outside anywhere. It is inside us. So this is our own nature. So we cultivate that more and more. Now, there are religious centers, Christian centers, that deal with drug addiction. And they turn people on, this is their language, way of expressing it. They turn people on to Jesus Christ. That's what they do. And you see, so their attachment, their development, they call it a born again. It's not that they believe in reincarnation. It's that they have a new lease of life, a new interest. They are able to rally the emotions round because all these addictions are as a result of attempting to find some emotional satisfaction somewhere, either through physical satisfaction, and physical satisfaction will have an effect on the mental chemistry. So you take some drugs, for example, that raise up the level of endorphins and what have you. But you see, spiritual life raises its own endorphins. I think there have been good studies on meditating people who go into an internal state of joy. Naturally, it comes out. And then you see the chemistry of the brain changes. That means the physiology changes. But more than that, what you may not know is it changes the actual environment. And so while Charles Darwin was thinking, oh, I've ignored the full impact of the environment to a great extent, now we know that that works, and we call this epigenetics, impact of epigenetics, that you can cultivate and inherit characteristics by shifting your view of things. In other words, by shifting your reactions to things. But this is way, way after Darwin. And so he was ignoring the environment. What he didn't know was that you're affecting your environment all the time. This was known by the ancient yogis. They had the system, not just the ancient yogis, the ancient rishis, because their fundamental thrust, even in the Karma Kanda portion of the Vedas, was we can transform our environment. How do we do it? We light a sacred fire. We put some rituals in. And then we put mental movements and intentions in called mantras. And these mantras will then be taken by a cosmic mind, and the cosmic mind will then rearrange suitably all the subtle elements, and it'll arrive here. We have a good example of that, mentioned so many times before, of the evaporation from the seas of water, leaving the salt behind, coming up into the clouds. Don't think it's a local area because there's spreading everywhere. And these clouds develop, accumulate nicely, cumulus, until the pressure is so much and that it shifts around the earth and falls as rainfall onto the fields. Knowing that they required food, they felt, well, we can have to manipulate rainfall. Now in South America, they're trying to I think it's Mexico, they're trying to manipulate rainfall by seeding clouds, as they call it, inserting chemicals into clouds and precipitating the rainfall like that. But the ancient sages knew a better way. You don't have to fly above the clouds to do this or interfere with nature. You use the forces of nature. And the forces of nature have their origin in mental movement, the mind. The mind is the most powerful thing. Thought, there is nothing quicker than thought or more powerful than thought. So when we talk about the Ramayana, we talk about various weapons and mantras. You may well think that these are thoughts, powerful, powerful thoughts accompanied by the mental movement, the corresponding verbal movement of it, called mantra. And so this is the way we can manipulate our environment. Everyone has the capacity to change their own environment, be it their physical environment, be it their mental environment, and be it their external environment. Now, this introduction of terms of internal, external, and so on and so forth is purely convenience terms, because our highest philosophy says, actually, you take time away, we take space away, you only find a unity. That nothing divided is there. It's undivided, it's unchanging, and it's an infinite. And it expresses itself in this physical world. In physics, has gravity and electrical energy and inertia. And it comes out in 3 evolutionary forces called gunas that tend to bind us and keep us with this understanding of the world and makes us attached. And collectively, this is called Maya. And we call it Mother Maya because Maya and nature are the same thing. And these are synonymous terms, Prakriti, Maya, and so on, all synonymous terms. This is Mother Nature. And Mother Nature, should we squash it? No. Should we use Mother Nature? Yes. Mother Nature giving us the opportunity, here, my child, I have a secret for you. Learn it. And if you suffer from it, this is learning as well. And you want to avoid that. So here is a surefire way. Cultivate this quality of sattva. Saturate the mind with all the noble qualities of truth and beauty and goodness and love and harmony. Put all of that in. Beam with joy. Spread your joy everywhere. And when you do that, that is one of the greatest services that you can do. It is a myth generated sometimes by missionaries to say that in Hinduism, they're only interested in withdrawing from the world, that kind of detachment. They're only interested in their own spiritual development. They couldn't care about society at last. They have no social conscience whatsoever. Of course, Vivekananda comes along and changes that, but all he's doing is resorting back to those people who, being of steady wisdom, are dedicated to the welfare of all beings. Now, this goes way beyond the scope of Christian compassion, because it says all beings. Buddha says the same thing, all beings. That is not just human beings. It's every single living creature. The whole of life is a throbbing variation of one entity which religion calls God. That's all it's there. That's all that's there. So recognize it and be free. Don't try and stop attachment. You attach to something better, attach to something higher, and so-called detachment will happen by itself. That is why the formula doesn't start with vairagya or detachment. It starts with viveka, discernment. You start by having a different interpretation of the world, getting used to that. Once you get used to that, automatically you will be detached from the things which are trivial and have less meaning, and attached to something which has more meaning, which is deeper, more truthful, more yielding of happiness and joy. Surely that's a better addiction. And so it's put in this way in the Judeo-Christian context, and it's found in Deuteronomy, if you're going to research there, and replicated when Jesus is asked, what shall I do to gain eternal life? And he gives a counter question, as a good teacher does, and says, well, what do you think, And what is the greatest commandment? Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, thy soul, thy mind, thy strength. We can elaborate the terms with your whole energy, in short. So every physical movement, every mental movement is dedicated toward that. That's what you should do. That is the key to everything. Everything else is minor. Love your neighbor as yourself comes as a result, because there's no division. So the discernment, the discrimination, the viveka we are talking about, on the one side is determining things which are not real. Neti neti, this is not this, is not this. But on the other side is asserting it is this, it is this. And very often people involved in Advaita Vedanta ignore that side of it. No, there's a oneness there. And then how will we observe it? We'll observe it in its manifested form, as well as its potential form. Don't ignore that. That means the whole world is just a variation of one being. Recognizing this fact will have its effect, and its effect is called detachment. You don't have to cultivate it. It's an effect. It's an effect that comes from discernment. Now, of course, there is a different kind of detachment that comes under the label of tapasya or discipline, self-discipline. And the self-discipline really is strengthening the will, because if we allow the mind's attention to go toward the elements of our addiction or attachments, then that's not going to serve us well. So there has to be some kind of regularity and discipline. Is described scientifically for its age as an electrical current by Swami Vivekananda in his Raja Yoga. He says, supposing you take all these electrons, you move them in one direction, then you have an electrical current. It requires everything to flow in the same way. When it's not flowing in the same way, it's just there, it's potentially there, and so on. To make it kinetic, you have to make it flow in one way. It's called electrical current. So he was very keen to explain all these things in the light of the modern physics of his day. And electricity was there, and alternating current was exhibited for the first time at the Columbian Exposition, where Swami Vivekananda gave his first wonderful series of talks at the Parliament of Religions, and made a great impact, not just on the Western world, but the whole of the world, actually. When you read these things, you see how beautifully and powerfully delivered they were. And so he puts it all in the language of the modern science of his day. And he's talking about energy, prana. If you want to control prana, the energy that ultimately yields in spiritual growth, making it all flow in one direction, you have to create a regulated life, a disciplined life to that extent. And so you can imagine that all the sense organs are like administrative faculties, or like gateways is another impression that we can use, or they are like small sub-bureaucratic offices. And so when the ears want to hear scandal and gossip, then the central controller says, oh, wait, that's going to produce misery for myself and others. Let me stop that. What will I do with the ears? Well, I rather listen to sweet words. I rather listen to sweet music. I rather listen to birdsong. I rather listen to people who will elevate the mind. That's what I'll do with the ears. What about speech? Well, we're all speaking internally, but even external speech, maybe I'll decide when there's an impulse to react, I'll just keep quiet. That's one of the most difficult things. I'll just keep quiet. Or I'll formulate something that will have a transforming effect on the other person, and I won't agree to be dragged down by their negativity. I'll either avoid them completely, or I will turn the conversation around to something more positive. First of all, agreeing, say, yes, it does look like that, but have you considered something else? So in this way, we can turn around the faculty of speech. In this way, every single thing we can turn around. And instead of, you see, so you might find somebody with an alcohol addiction, we say, well, you have to drink something that is pleasant. Formerly, you thought that this alcohol, vodka, or whatever it is pleasant, and put you into an inebriated state where you couldn't care about anything, makes you less inhibited. But you see, here's the language of all the mystics: to be inebriated with divine ecstasy, inebriated with God's love, inebriated with bliss, using the same language, inebriation, but just taking something else to be inebriated from. Am I mad? Yes, you're mad from God, says Bairu Brahmani to Sri Ramakrishna. You have a madness, and some people are mad after this and that and the other, but you're mad for God, so it's quite a good madness, actually. Rest is harmful and not very good. And so we have to create our magnificent obsession. And the magnificent obsession we find will be in the duly allotted divine context that is always presented for us. So thank you for that question. I hope that's been answered adequately. I wanted to touch on, I have to do a separate broadcast on the story of Rama, but I wanted to point out something. When I do that talk, and I haven't had the time to do it yet, I wanted to point out some astonishing things, which brings us into a realm of realism, which leads us to an understanding things should change in ourselves. And so bringing out this negative realism, if we stop it there, it has a damaging effect on us. But if we use it and go ahead and say, let's learn a lesson from it, then it's good. There are 32 countries today, as I'm speaking, who are engaged in conflict. There are 18 terrorist insurgencies throughout the world. There are 9 civil wars going on as I speak. There are 2 drug wars in South America and Colombia and Mexico, other countries. There is one war of ethnic violence going on, at least one war. Historically, and I come from Africa, so I'm aware of this acutely, probably more than you or others, but there was a war in the Congo going from 1998 to, let's say, 2003, and is still going on to some extent. And so over the 5 years, 5 million people died. You never heard of it, probably. 5 million people suffered. Even going back to religious warfare in the 30 Years' War, which was called Protestants, Catholics, some 8 million people died over 30 years. In the First World War, 18 million people died. And 1 century ago, that is in 1918, by 1918, that war was over, but the after effects continued. And that was 18 million people perished in that war. In the Second World War, 70 million people perished. Now, this is in our lifetime. This is only, it's only a century ago, really. So not exactly in our lifetime necessarily, but, it's nothing within the scope of human history. So in the Ramayana, in the story of Rama, we find the same kind of thing. There must have been, if you take away all the embellishments and so on, the central thing, it's itihasa. It is a history. Some 5,000 years ago, there must have been a war with such a devastating impact, something like a World War I or a World War II, that decimated the leaders of some communities and so on, and stood out in memory of humanity for some 5,000 years. Same thing with the Mahabharata for 3,000 years, stood out in people's memories. And so what do we learn from it? Well, exactly what I've been talking about earlier. We can avoid these colossal tragedies by cultivating a sense of peace of mind for ourselves. More importantly, by cultivating an education system that teaches children in society the deeper values of life. Now, can you do it through conventional mainstream religion? Yes. Is it popular in developed countries? No. Except America, it's still a popular thing. But in Europe, pretty much mainstream religion is at a low ebb. Apart from some countries like Romania, for example, I think it's one of the most religious countries in a conventional sense. So why are people turning away? So Swami Vivekananda, with his great foresight and insight, was able to say and feel all the answers to our theological questions, Our scientific questions are founded in this Vedanta. And so this is why it's important to teach Vedanta and practice Vedanta and understand Vedanta, because our youth will appreciate this Vedanta because it is outside a conventional framework of a social structure of interests, which is orientated more toward technology and what technology has to offer. And so this attachment that you're talking to, or this addiction, or whatever you want to call it, is really based on entertainment. There's much more. Technology provides us much more with entertainment. And so what is more entertaining, what is more joyful than the divine has to be discovered. And once people discover this, of course, the other thing automatically disappears and goes away without us addressing it directly.
Swamiji, what is a good way to start? Maybe very briefly, because it's only 5 minutes, but when people are addicted to smoking or alcohol and they see that as a source of pleasure or relief, and they aren't particularly spiritual or not in the, maybe they are religious, but not necessarily spiritual, what is a good way to help them at least start or reflect on that journey? I remember Sri Ramakrishna said, if you need to drink, drink, but say a prayer before you drink. But how to start or nudge them on that direction, if it's possible at all? I don't know.
Well, I would suggest that it's none of our business in a way, all right? Of course, if we love somebody dearly and we feel they're damaging themselves, naturally the impulse is, well, we'll have to do something, but what can we do? And the best way to teach people is through example. So I know one particular devotee whose family are traditional Irish drinkers, and they're completely not only surprised by the devotees' teetotalism, put it that way, but also ridiculing it, you know. And so, what does she do? This particular devotee, well, continue with her lack of her not drinking. And that person, no doubt, will be very healthy, and they may notice this person is being healthy and so on and so forth. But if you're a psychologist dealing with these difficulties, you'll want to know what is the fundamental root psychological cause, if it is in the alcoholic range. So there is drinking, and there is the alcoholism, and sometimes it's difficult to draw a line and say what is what. For example, I'm fully aware that in Ireland, young people who are normally responsible are completely responsible on Saturdays and Sundays. And you go to Dublin, and I'm sure you can witness such things at Temple Bar in the city. And so it's part of a social culture which is there, and it's a serious problem. It's a serious problem because many of the other crimes occur because of drunkenness. Crimes of sexual assault, for example, and so on, all of these, and abuse, domestic violence, all of these can arise from alcoholism. And where does it develop culturally? Sometimes it develops because of impoverished conditions. Historically, that would be the case in Ireland, no doubt. So depends on the individual. If it's a very, very serious problem, then we probably have to bring in professional advice. This is true of every kind of malady like this. You bring in professional advice. If it's just a person who is just drinking a lot or smoking a lot, you see, I often tell people, I only smoke when I'm on fire, and then there's a lot of puffing, but or blowing, I should say. But anyway, so example is a good teacher. That's the first thing. But you see, if we see that smoking is having a deleterious effect, is creating emphysema and ultimately lung cancer, very often the people who are addicted to smoking will not listen to any amount of reasoning. And even if reasoning is presented, the need, the emotional need, or whatever it is, or the physical need, is much more powerful. I'll give you a typical dialogue. You should really stop smoking. Have you heard your breathing? The statistics on lung cancer, and the response is typically, sure, you have to die of something. It's my only pleasure. These are some of the excuses that are presented. Well, if a person is strong-willed in that direction, there's nothing much you can do. See, God in them is the normal remedy, of course. Be compassionate toward them, see the God in them, and try to be empathetic toward them to see, okay, what is this? Food addiction is a big one also. So food addiction, drug addiction, and under that I'm including tobacco, marijuana, and other things, cocaine, and so on and so forth, as well as alcohol. And alcohol is probably the most popular and legitimized one today. Marijuana is increasingly being legitimized too. And there's an argument that it may be better than, say, tobacco, but I don't know. So anyway, putting a foreign substance outside that goes inside. Of course, historically, culturally, most cultures will have a version of it, And in moderation, it's okay, I suppose, if it's not doing any long-term harm, and if it's creating a cultural need as well as a physical need. But by the same token, moderation, of course, in all things. Don't eat too much, nor eat too little. Drink too much, nor drink too little. Sleep too much, nor sleep too little, is the balance that Sri Krishna gives us in the Bhagavad Gita. Moderation in all things. That's an important point because it's not abstination, it's not abstaining, it's moderation. Moderation, definition of a treat is just an occasional delight. But all delights can be registered to the divine, divinely supplied, divinely enjoyed, divinely digested. So number two is, of course, want to help. The helper personality wants to help everybody, of course. But it's more difficult when there's somebody extremely close to you and you realize the damage that is happening and the lack of acknowledgement of it and the unwillingness to change. Of course, that's a little difficult. Sometimes professional advice has to be brought. That is a set of eyes and ears and everything, which is not so involved in the immediate situation. A more objective intervention, put it that way. Well, we'll leave it there, shall we?
Thank you so much.